And we will try to enter in the space and the spatial strategies that are, of course, political, social, aesthetic. And this is how we will enter in the practice as Doreen foreground. And I want to highlight one of the main strategies of the exhibition, in which somehow collectively contemporary artists, but also the once known creators that are the creators of each of the works of the collection of modernist artist Karl Schmidt-Rottluff, also participate actively in the exhibition. We will see most of the works in the presentation. And I would like to depart to tell somehow the history behind how I arrived to the strategies and at all to the project that is organized by the Brücke Museum that take place in the neighboring house that we will see, Kunsthaus Dahlem, and is the exhibition Parapolitics, in which I follow many cases of exhibitions in the Cold War. I cannot expand. All the time I feel in the presentations, I am in an entropic process because one takes one path and leaves many other possible paths. So therefore, in the questions, it's important from your practice, your space, you catch some of the threads and we return. So here I follow many models of exhibitions. And here you see how this artist, that is a kind of Picasso of Germany, expressionist artist Karl Schmidt-Rottluff, he was collecting especially African sculptor, but also from Oceania, from Mexico, and from Asia since 1913. So quite in parallel to more known Picasso. And this I said not as an anecdote, but because these artists were very picky, so to say, with the dates. Nevertheless, when we see the exhibition in which he presented one of the, what he called source of inspiration of his painting, a mask from Cameroon, he didn't date this mask, while his painting had the author, Karl Schmidt-Rottluff, a title, The Afrikanisches, also polemic, and a date, 1964. Then I criticized in Parapolitics the Eurocentric, also usually male white gaze that was embedded in this exhibition display, and somehow also serve as a model how exhibitions are not only showing, but also erasing. So in this case, erasing the author of the Cameroonian mask and its history. It displayed ahistorical. And this also allowed further instrumentalization that this mask was decontextualized, without function, presented as a beautiful form. And this is somehow the foundation of what we call the formalist art discourse in the post-war or Cold War by the modern artist. So the director of the museum, Lisa Marie Schmidt, came to Parapolitics. There were many of these short stories and exhibitions. In specifically this case, as you see maybe in the text, I can share the whole essay later. I also conceptualize how this modern formalistic discourse was also a colonial gaze. The source of inspiration, if we say it not such in a euphemistic way, was also considering the mask as a raw material. What I term in the transition exhibition, it was a cultural appropriation. I will show a few images of Saba Innab display because we are doing a dialogue, but I couldn't get out of the temptation to start in the space. So when we enter, this violence of the exhibition that we assume that shows, make public, exhibit, but at the same time is hiding, erasing, also producing an epistemicide, so the destruction of culture, is visualized by the display that has the same title by Saba Innab. Since the beginning, when we enter, we don't see anything. So we confront a barrier. In this case, transition exhibition is doing a double move. Let's try to follow it. That is to confront these power structures, these asymmetries of power, but at the same time, don't stay in the confrontation, but look to transform, to make some shifts, but some transitions. It's not complete. It's a humble but active operation. And we will see that it's not complete simply because complete would be the restitution of this collection. This is the image that you know that was in the poster. And I only want to show the main, one of the main operations of this structure. What is this structure performing in the space? If you see the text, this structure is activating two semicircles. So for us, it was important how the semicircle was a structure that recognized that other half is not there, that other half is unknown, and that other half is also somehow conceptualized and spatialized. So it did not attempt to fulfill, but to acknowledge this violence and this epistemicide, this reduction of works that were considered, for example, only objects when they were part of life, of works that were considered only form when they were also part of people, of communities, of practices, to mention some of the operations, or to consider these works as anonymous or part of groups or part of what they call non-European, when these works had, of course, an author that could have been contemporary, but the artist didn't date, didn't keep any note with the context. And this is something that the museum and as institution work. One of the half hosted the collection of more than 100 works from Oceania, Africa, Asia, some from the Americas, especially the region of Mexico. And the other half circle hosted a program of listening, sound pieces, and also conversations, reading, engagement. So this other half was an option to engage with the other half. Before the opening, the Afro-Brazilian artist Marina Dubia did the first performance. Also, for us was important to acknowledge the very violence of the temporality of the exhibition, how we confront culture from to this date, and what happened before and after. So for us, it was very important to confront the building in which the exhibition was taking place, the Kunsthaus Dahlem, originally an atelier constructed in the Nazi time for one of the favorite architects and sculptors of the Nazi regime, Arno Bretter. It was important to confront the context in which these collections of works that are somehow in the diaspora, displaced from their places, from their context, from their life, would be more welcome. I invited Marina Dubia. I will read this later. Marina Dubia with the performance Perto, in Portuguese means close, that have been doing a series of performances in which she confronts the walls of the exhibition, the floor, all the medium, but at the same time give affection to the artworks, even trying to kiss them. In the performance area of the exhibition that are for traces, you could see some photos documenting this performance that happened before, and also a letter of which I will read you an excerpt, and if you want, I can read you the full letter in the Q&A. I arrived in this room on December 10th at 2 p.m. with the ambition to get as close as possible to you, to inhabit the desire to kiss you, touch you, the artworks, practices, and physical entities, architecture inclusive, who meet here for the coming transition. You, plural, from disparate geographies and ages, seeking to rejoin in kin. As the body approaches you, the distance between us becomes more dense, palpable, sculpted by agreements, promises, contracts, by trust, by the broth and the breath of exchange words that allow my breath and warmth to reach you, and interact a bit with a surface of atoms, first grains of your structure as we develop some intimacy. It continues. At the end, for I know you touch me back, and this is cherished. Marina Dubia, Kunsthaus Dahle. Just to make clear that the entropy goes not so radical, I have some notes on how the transition exhibition we use exactly a term that you have been discussing, confrontation, the colonial legacy of this collection. When the director invited me to say, PAZ, I saw your story and critique in Parapolitic on Karl Schmidt-Rottluff collection and Eurocentric gaze. I don't know if you're aware that in the Brücke Museum, we have his whole collection, and he collected more than 100 works from different regions. Would you be interested to problematize it and question it? Since the invitation was already a critical condition, I was interested, but not only because of this, also the museum was doing structural changes. So the temporality of the exhibition would be the larger context of a 10 years work in which they hire new professionals, Anna Bruce, for example, to do the provenance research. I will show you that will try to trace the provenance, so where comes the works, the date that was not noted earlier, and the function, how they were in life. And not only this, they agreed to publish for the opening of the transition exhibition all the collection on the Wiki Commons, and this would allow then the transition to work, since Anna Bruce is contacting people from different places, and the exhibition will be on, the collection will be online. Then, consequently, some claim of restitution also could be activated. At the same time of the confrontation, the exhibition attempts to overcome the asymmetrical power structures that I mentioned and the colonial continuities, although we know that many of the official colonial regimes are not in action. We're following the colonial continuities, especially in the cultural field and in the exhibition displays, in its narratives, categories, and perspectives. Like other modern artists, Schmidt-Rottluff admired the formal characteristics of these works and appropriated them as motive for his own art, as we saw with the painting. There is no information on author, dates, or provenance in his estate. Some authors, I read a lot of literature, everything that existed, said, oh, maybe the documentation was destroyed because his department was bombed in the Second World War, but this is only a hypothesis. They were thus, I thought, objectified, historized, and understood only as sources of inspiration. This is a quote that Schmidt-Rottluff said, and also Alfred Barr, that is, we will see the author and champion of the formalist narrative from the Museum of Modern Art, a practice of cultural appropriation prevalent among the modern European avant-garde. In the transition exhibition, Schmidt-Rottluff collection is exhibited and critically reflected for the first time. The presentation also questioned the format of museum collection exhibitions, which are traversed by Western colonial structures. This was important for us to show how exhibitions are not exceptions, that they are also traversed by colonial structures. The interventions by contemporary artists that I will introduce you intend to problematize and also, as Doreen was telling, unlearn those colonial continuities, such as imbalances of power and the inherited formalist canon of modernism that I already opened this debate. They offer also propositions for alternative narratives and open up spaces. This is important for agencies and community. This is important as in parapolitics, it became clear to me how the modern artist, Karl Schmidt-Rottluff, Picasso, is a system that shaped the individual while suppressing or marginalizing the collective works or ordering them, transforming them in the other, in a region without author. The works is important in the transition exhibition, brings life. So in living the exhibition with practices that I could condense in practices of remembering, listening, and storytelling. In this way, culture is experienced more as a living activity versus the objectification that we see in the modernist frame. While the violence of colonialism on this collection reduce them as objects without life, as form, authorless, ahistorical, continues to this day, because so many collections of this we know because we're in Berlin, in one of the places in which these collections are highly debated, continues to this day. So we acknowledge this continuity. We thought many times as an affiliation that the operations we do to confront and transition these works could also find alliances with all the other collections that are close in the city. So one of the transitions that I was happy to open up and to find an answer to the question without knowing the answer when we posed the question was how to give authorship to this work that had been authorless before. So talking to Anna Bruce, the scholar that the museum hired for doing the provenance research, as you see, this is the poster of the exhibition. Each work now start having a draft. This is the status of November with the provenance, the function of the work, and the date. And I did a very difficult question to Anna Bruce. I asked her, Anna, how you will credit the author. It's so important to do some gesture of recognizing that it was an author behind, an artist, a creator. And she said, yeah, but we don't know the author. So we can just say undocumented, unknown author. And then I insisted, I say, yeah, but this would mean to repeat the violence of this catalog. They gave us a catalog, an Excel sheet, and we want to do some transition. So it's not a way to recognize the author. Let's think, even if we don't know the name, how can we do it? And fortunately, she remembers in this moment and says, PAZ, you know, is indigenous practitioners in Canada. Anna is very informed of the debate. She has been doing conferences on restitution and reparation that use the term once known creators for some of the collections that they have been engaged in Canada. So this is how we found a way to bestow, to give recognitions, a transition of these authorships. It was very impressive, I will share with you, because at the same time, Anna opened the computer and changed all the authorship of the Wiki Commons with one click, and what was named undocumented author, it became once known creator. And the entrance is a very nuanced painting intervention that you see by Ruth Buchanan. And Ruth Buchanan also did a critical dialogue with the monumental building that came from the Nazi area. She wanted to paint, you will see my arm, only until the human scale, the arm can take the brush to signal, to show the monumentality and the non-human scale of the building. But moreover, Ruth also invited the female practitioners of the museum to co-paint this wall. So the director, me, I think Sarah also co-painted. And if the modernist artist almost never went out of the canvas and also never acknowledged the context, somehow similar bias, here we see a more feminist collective intervention in which the context is acknowledged. While Ruth was painting, the walls absorbed very quickly the mix. So Ruth had to confront physically and painterly, this kind of fascist wall with insistence. Then also it was very important to continue to work with such Hoyt. You see some headphones in the exhibition that you can take and move around to walk. Such Hoyt had been doing a practice of resurrecting, awaking instruments that are often at colonial collections. And this is another shift. At the beginning, we were introduced to an ethnological collection. But since science is also a part of the colonial modern matrix, and how science also pretend to display somehow objectivity, truth, we had to tackle it, and we simply call it afterwards the colonial collection. In this case, such got the permission from the museum, because the museum was really open to do the transformation, the transition, and he played some of the musical instruments that are at the Karl Schmidt-Rottluff collection, a double bell, drums, a flute, and mixed it with the more than 90 instruments that he has at his studio from Africa, and with electronic music. So it's very important in this exhibition how documentary practices go along imaginary practices. So what it could have been, what it could have been, becomes important in his practice. I will share his sound now with the share sound. For such Hoyt, the instruments, I will tell at the same time, they have a spirit. So they have not been made to be trapped in crates or in vitrines, but they have a spirit that have been made to be played. Somehow, in his work, there is a sonic ablation. He reconnects them with life and saves them from this status of object of one of the main violences of these colonial exhibitions, that is to objectify culture. We can listen more after. I will go quickly. And Manuela Garcia Aldana, an artist that also engaged with the sonic circle. And this was very important, how she compiled in this sound piece testimonies that are critic to colonial collections and responding to one of the main challenges of this exhibition, that I pose a question, how the exhibition can be a medium that is not affirmative, but that is questioning its own foundations and condition. So this was the first question that started the project more than 1 year ago, and how to make an exhibition in which the common experience can tackle this objectification of exhibitions. These testimonies, sometimes they would say it's wrong to show these works because they were never made to be exhibited. Other testimony could say, was saying, you have, this work has to be restituted. This is the only solution. In between the testimonies that you can listen, I will share the poster, the PDF, is here the quote, because it's 30 minutes. Manuela also invited a female indigenous singer to sing to the artwork a rite of passage. And this rite of passage is dedicated to invite, to convoke the works to have the right to change their current condition and transform, transition into another context. Here you see the artist in the half-circle space. And we will follow Marina in her confrontation to the second floor of the exhibition. So we continue with Saba to go in depth in the display. We will see the works and the problems that Saba was tackling. So here we see the poster by Afro-American artist Hank Willis Thomas. If this artist, the modern artists, were not working in the operation of contextualizing, but very much obsessed or fascinated by the form, here Hank Willis Thomas is doing the work of contextualization that was not done. So if the original diagram that tells the history of all the isms, all the avant-garde, that was done in 1936 by Alfred Barr, the director and curator at MoMA, and that was titled Cubism and Abstract Art. You know, for Cubism it was so important, the African sculptor, that Alfred Barr, for this exhibition, couldn't get the loan of Mademoiselle d'Avignon, so it included a photocopy, because it was fundamental to explain that this painting led to abstract art. So all the isms were going to or geometrical or not geometrical abstract art, according to his art history, formalist art history. Not even artists were agree with this narrative. For example, I remember it's a letter by Kandinsky that says, but Alfred Barr, you came to my studio, you didn't understand anything of the spirituality of my work. Or Molinoge from the Bauhaus says, I don't want to be in this march toward abstraction. And Hank Willis Thomas in 2019 renamed the diagram from Cubism and abstract art to colonialism and abstract art, and added all the context, the colonial context that was missing, the foundations in the Congo by the Belgian Empire, for example, but also he erased terms like end sculptor that are racist. And here just to remember, this is the diagram that Hank Willis Thomas somehow vandalized, recontextualized, and analyzed the racist bias of this formalist narrative. And I always want to include Meir Shapiro. I will not read it now unless you ask me later for time, how Marxist art historians at the same time that this diagram was published also criticized Alfred Barr for not including the context and the conditions in which his narrative was occurring. And if we continue, the second floor, there are a series of works that I was thinking as a counter cartographies or counter narratives. Here is Mariana Castillo de Val, and this is a very simple but sophisticated conceptual work in which she takes the pages of the books of the museum in which are masks from Africa or Oceania or the Americas, and remove the image and only follow the planes, these planes that the modern artists were fascinated by and that were the foundation of abstract art. So somehow here Mariana managed to visualize the projection that each artist was doing, and by doing this also reducing, almost erasing the work that they were admiring. So the operation of reduction and projection. We follow Marina. And this is the work by Nena Unuova, a Ghanaian and Nigerian artist that is currently in Berlin. She's working at the Decoloniale. I was interested in Nena also by the operation of contextualization. Here we see her work Pathways. In the Decoloniale, she's addressing by a sound piece the M Street in Mitte, also confronting the colonial legacy of this name and seeking for transformations to change the name ultimately. And here for us was important to recognize that in the surrounding area of the museum, there are also around 30 streets that still have colonial names. But Nena didn't do this precise one-to-one operation to tell what is the meaning of each of the colonial street names, but she located the Ghanaian and Nigerian sculptors of Karl Schmidt-Rottluff collection from her hometown, and did a map of the area surrounding the museum, not repeating the violence to tell, oh, Bismarckplatz. Bismarck was the kind of emperor of the Berlin Congo Conference 1884. She didn't want to re-narrate the actions and colonial consequences of each of these characters, but included in the lines statements, official statements that led to the colonization, and in other lines, expressions of the art history, to somehow construct the conditions that allow these sculptors from her hometown to arrive in the studio of the modern artist in Berlin. In the sound piece that you can follow in the code that I will share with the poster later, she asked also friends in Ghana to explain how they move in the city when often street has no name. So ultimately, the big question is, how do we remember, comparing these two locations? This is a collective work by Lisa May David, Keiko Kimoto, and Gabriel Rosel Santillan, artists that have been working since some years in the cultural unit of the Pacific, already shifting the Eurocentric view that is more or less the Atlantic to the Pacific. And they build up a tapestry to acknowledge the violent context that has been ongoing since colonization due to the extractivism. So you see these machines of extractivism in the tapestry, but also the resistance, how the stories survive and resist through songs, stories for kids or legends, and the flora and fauna that, although survive, many are endangered by the current radiation in the Pacific. This tapestry was also a kind of device for storytelling. And finally, this is a work by Lisa Healy, an artist from Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea was also a former colony of Germany. We don't know as much. And I wanted to put an effort to engage with Lisa Healy, since she has been working very serious and very engaged with and against archives, and moreover also opening up intergenerational conversations. In the first, on the top series of photos, she says, at 8 years old, I didn't believe that my island was called New Britain. So she's tackling also the toponymia, what is named the name of places of Papua New Guinea that still has continuities of colonialism in the name of the island. And this was a sentence that she said to the mother. And although the mother is indigenous, she says, yes, it's New Britain. When I asked to Lisa why, she said, because they were still educated in the colonial frame. So she wanted to open up to the mother and to the generation of the ancestor and problematize the names. Also, it was also named there, an archipelago was called also Bismarck Archipelago. So you could see somehow the expansion of colonialism from having the same name in Papua New Guinea and around the museum very close. And she renamed it Rabaul. So you see the last series, she wrote it in English, Creole, and the indigenous language of the mother, the name in indigenous. And to finish, the image in the center is an image that she found in the Museum of Ethnology in Berlin. And again, the problem of the label. While the German colonizer was credited with his name, his function, in the photo, the Papua New Guinean woman and kid were not named. But Lisa Healy is a great researcher. So she found the name and she wrote it over somehow you see how artists like Han Willis Thomas, through documentary practice and intervention, and she wrote, her name is La Vaverkai. And this opened up also a tragic and sad experience of instrumentalization. Many times, German colonizer would marry local women to integrate, and when the job finished, they will abandon them. So in the exhibition, you would also sometimes connect and with the sadness and tragedy, dispossession. If you see part of the collection, you see some pots for water or food. And you imagine maybe they were displaced from a table of a family, of a group. So still you can recognize these strategies of violence. And from the top, I don't want to go in advance because maybe here it's good to connect to Saba. You could also connect with the display and some works of Papua New Guinea. For example, this shield in the right is a shield that has a face and some branches. It's quite fragile, and it's also ceremonial. It represents a spirit. I think I will leave it here, so because it took me longer, and Saba could take from here.
Thank you so much, PAZ. And yeah, so just a little note in the chat, please keep your questions, put the question in the chat that you have for PAZ. I suggest that we continue with you, Saba, immediately. So
sure.
Voila.
Just want to say thank you first for the invitation and for the technical support, and PAZ for the lovely, not intro, rather like a background of the whole project. I would like to start by situating the transition exhibition in relation to my practice in general. So maybe you feel like there's a little bit of a detour, but I think it's very important to connect. So my practice is centered around space in relation to time, and constantly rethinking, dwelling, and building in the temporary that is deforming into a permanent state, departing from the Palestinian refugeehood and exile, migration, and the meaning of building in the colonial time. To draw an abstract outline, I think in retrospect, I noticed that I'm following almost the same methodologies. Of course, they evolve, but somehow I can trace them back to the same origin. And you can also find them or trace them and find their traces in the transition exhibition. One methodology is based on collecting, and collecting particularly spatial moments, architecture typologies, know-hows of dwelling in, as I mentioned, in suspension and in waiting. But this process, it has an epistemological nature because it's an attempt to collect the elusive and the irrepresentable through finding the embedded meaning in the material, in the know-how of the building material. Yeah, so a certain spatial moment, for example, could connect a refugee camp to a city of refuge and migration of labor, for example, and where we can draw a spectrum or an inventory of architecture of temporariness that is, I think, very necessary to decolonize, for decolonization and returning, through making models and spatial interventions and drawing and mapping. Another subject of collection is curative architecture. And to give an example, a very particular example to this methodology is the tunnel. For example, this project, What is Unseen Cannot Be Broken, was the title of a sculptural work. I'm very uncomfortable by calling it sculpture, but I think it's, yeah. So the work is based on a found image of a Gazan tunnel being partially exposed. So seeing the tunnel strips it of its function, of the fact that it has to be unseen, of its essence of being unseen. And in this context in particular, the tunnel, the invisibility is what keeps the tunnel existing. So seeing becomes destroying. When exposed, the parts that are exposed, they become the sign of the colonizer and the sign of the impossibility of movement that is embedded in the structure. So the exposed parts of the tunnel are modeled as fragments of a body that has been excavated rather than being exposed, and there's a big difference. Where everything changes its meaning immediately, an arch is a structural element, for example, when it's underground. Once it's seen in isolation, it becomes a reference to architectural gesture, in reference to authority. And the fragments themselves become an oxymoron. This cast of an image was displayed in the Hall of Architecture at the Carnegie Museum of Art, in the middle of hundreds of cast, real size, one-to-one casts of plaster, casts of architecture masterpieces done on the original facades and objects since that opened in the beginning of the century, of the 20th century. And the space itself is basically filled with signs of hegemony and authority, representing dominant architectural styles and pre-modern architecture from Gothic and Romanesque masterpieces. So this body this body not only interrupts the space, but is an invitation to imagine the source of this form, of the excavated body. And it has also a temporal significance. And it freezes the exposed parts of the tunnel before its destruction, and therefore it has a very temporal significance, as I mentioned. This is linked directly to another methodology, which is basically based on cultivating withdrawal, active refusal and rejection. And in 2015, I was invited to participate in a retrospective exhibition on abstraction and politics from 1915 to 2015 at the Whitechapel Gallery in London. The invitation was to show a specific project titled How to Build Without the Land, which in itself dwells on refusal. But it generated originally from a confrontation on the ground with an actual dilemma. When I was part of a team of reconstruction as an architect to rebuild a Palestinian refugee camp that was destroyed in 2009. So a question transformed from how do you rebuild the elusive? How do you plan something that is so temporary, that has deformed into a permanent state, into how do you build without a land, basically in the absence of a very particular land. Oh, I'm moving too fast. We could talk more about this, of course, if you're interested later. So the title of the exhibition of the Whitechapel was Adventures of the Black Square, and it referred the work of Kazimir Malevich. I withdrew from the show before it opened upon becoming aware of funding provided by the Israeli Embassy in London For years, I tried to dismantle the heaviness around this incident. Is it a missed encounter? What is it exactly? Why this heaviness, basically? This questioning and dismantling became a multi-layered text. Became the multi-layered text, a love letter that unfolds into research and footnotes. In a technical drawing, a station point is the point from which a perspective is constructed. Anything that is located behind this point or in its blind spot will be absent from the drawing. This was the title and the framework of a show that opened in Berlin, 2019. The show probes spatial representation as a way to reflect on the entanglement of architecture and power. And it opens on a personal note, a love letter basically written to Malevich, highlighting the blind spots of European avant-garde and registering the impossibility of love between a Palestinian architect and the modern art movement that is essential to architecture education in general. And here I'm borrowing words written by curator Amal Barada about the show, about the spatial intervention in particular. Is there a way out of the frame? A set of columns and beams construct a single vanishing point. Not a specific structure, but perspective itself as structure. At its base lies a ruin made of claustra blocks, cut and arranged in a set of underground tunnels and inverted domes, reclaimed from buried history of vernacular construction. Upon looking at this landscape, one's gaze is systematically interrupted. Such fugitive architecture evades visual control. The inverted domes and tunnels, by experimenting with the material and form, the vulnerability is turned into a proposition for an alternative politics of space. Within an inhabitable world, the exhibition makes a plea for dwelling otherwise. And from here, I would like to enter into the transition exhibition. And I finished with the last two examples because they are directly linked and somehow provided the base for thinking in this project, especially around notions of reclamation through rejection and rejection through reclamation, and also ways of seeing. How do we show a colonial collection, and can hiding be showing also? Specifically, a colonial collection, as PAZ elaborated on, that was owned by a male artist, a collection that censors his desires, fetish, and appropriation that is disguised in a form of inspiration. We see an African mask in the foreground or the background of a painting, but we rarely see the mask on its own or know its creator, as if it needs another form of representation to be seen, a higher, more official Eurocentric recognition that claims discovery and genesis of representation in personal style and decoration even. How can we recognize the colonial uprootedness and disposition of an element and recognize that the same element for decades was only present through another form of colonial canon, and in this context it's a modernist painting, while also realizing how museums perpetuate historical semantics of power, and as a result you leave the frame of violence and power intact, as Hartman explains. How do you think, how to think against the different layers of violence of exhibiting methods and spaces, and how to make something inhabit a space, and how to imagine hidden groupings, overlapping lives, functions beyond the grid of dates, location, categories, and separation, and how to dismantle, also importantly, the architecture of the space, its connotations and history, and so on and so forth. These questions were different axes and facets to what seems somehow like extremely complicated task to do. That has basically different, the problem, if we look at it as a problem, it has multi facets, multi layers. Despite the apparent clarity of the task that we want to basically show a colonial collection and problematize it, the elusiveness somehow of being hosted in a space that is not collaborating or not part of the collaboration of the project, and being invited by an expressionist museum owning a colonial collection that is not an ethnographic museum, made the conditions full of cracks that one can actually infiltrate and confront and strategize. One question was present from the very beginning, like how, especially in the probably PAZ, you would like to talk about this later, the informal workshops that we had in the beginning of the thinking process with all the collaborators. How do we know that we are not being instrumentalized by the institution, and how do we know that we're not doing their work for them? So it was a constant negotiation, even though the invitation was under showing something critically. So the language automatically had to be changed. It's not an ethnographic collection, it's a colonial collection, and they're not objects, they're beings. And I think subtle things like that, like these details, made a lot of differences. And for me personally, it was very important to extend the discussion to the critique of the shortcomings of the decolonial theory and discourse, how abstract it tends to be, and how it's mostly comfortable to deal with history as a closed chapter, dealing only with corpse. And it was very important to constantly think and interrogate the idea of transition and restitution. In order to do that, one must dismantle decolonization from the present as much as we do from the past, and from the absence of the object subject, not only by recognizing how past colonial capitalist structures had transformed or metamorphosed into new forms of post-colonial context, but also by connecting to the ongoing settler colonialism, disposition, extractivism, and ethnic cleansing, and in the present as a front for dismantling this violence. To move to another point, we can't think of the display without thinking of the space, of course, and Paz mentioned it briefly. We cannot ignore this kind of space and its connotations, so it was very necessary to dismantle it, even if, at least formally, to disrupt its symmetry, its authority, and to build something that is more like a space within a space, even sometimes a landscape, to disrupt the monumentality, and also to block, constantly blocking and guiding movement. And yeah. So to go to the form, it was also a very interesting process for me, being someone who deals with space. I can say I have my language or my way, and somehow, if I may say, my intuition from the beginning was that I had to unlearn a few things to be able to deal with the many variables of this and of the questions of the situation. So the process involved a handful of proposals that went in parallel, and each had a specific angle or treatment or question to answer. So this intensive process of testing through forms and spatial interventions was methodology I find very necessary. it was evident that I had to step a little bit out of myself, my personal questions even, although they intersect fundamentally, of course, but something similar to a counter-intuition was very important, especially at the early stages. And then at the end, the form that we went with was I think the most form that tackled the problem from the micro to the macro, because it responded directly to the space and to the movement and to the monumentality of the space itself. Of course, the semicircle that Paz mentioned was probably the only thing that Paz requested from the early discussion, to have a hint or a trace of a semicircle, which was based on her many conversations with the Orlatur Alikura, and how the semicircle suggesting completeness, an invitation also to be complete. And as you can see, when the moment you enter, you're blocked, your vision is blocked, and you're somehow guided by the form to walk in a certain way, and then you are confronted with the collection. The collection that is placed on one of the semicircles that is slightly shifting, becoming an elliptical form, indicating a slight movement, where the beings themselves become the audience, the observers, and you are the one or the thing being observed. You cannot actually see that much. I mean, you don't get the 360 chance of examining each object. Each object is placed according to many like long process of examining what is the most careful way of placing an object. I mean, as much as we know and as much as we think we are being careful, because also sometimes you could be making a mistake without actually knowing, and there's a risk of that. And then finally, I'm going to go through the images of the space. As you can see, the first semicircle is the performance area, which you don't get to experience until you experience the collection, and then the flow is more free after you experience the collection, and you go back into the space, into the sound intervention and the performance area. And after finding the form and playing with it, there was another, I think this was the most difficult part of the process, is how to place each object and where and next to what, because also you don't want to project another layer of violence by categories, by listing, by simply strategies of exhibiting. And because there's not so much information about the collection, we had to also think of strategies to even if invisible strategies, to place these, to place the collection. So it was evident that we were not going to position them based on regions, and definitely we're going to place them beyond the gaze of the anthropology and the anthropologist, because of course this is the colonial gaze, but how to think beyond categories and the violence of segregation, listing, and so on and so forth. In the beginning, we had an intuition regarding hiding. it was always in the back of our mind that we actually want to show, but we want to hide as well. And how to deal with the sacred if we don't know what is sacred, and how to give all the possible care and respect. And for the lack of information and background, we had to imagine other things. In the process of, there was like a lot of trial and error that took place. So how do we group? Can we draw a line between the domestic and the sacred? Is it really possible? Because as many objects can be actually both, can be placed, and they're interchangeable in a way. Another strategy was to bring back each being to its essence, to its life before its disposition, even if it's a conceptual function. So, for example, nourishing, sonicity, healing, ceremonial, fight, and so on and so forth, were the logic behind the placement. So it was more of like an imaginary grouping that you don't see a trace of or like an official mention of, but rather like it's something that you can read when you look at the collection. You can imagine the seams between functions, and it's something similar to critical fabulation. So and you can see here, for example, the Excel sheet PAZ mentioned was transformed into color coding for us to understand what kind of life is hiding behind each tool, spoon, and this is how it looked in our mind before we placed it with the color coding. And you can see like how each group is infiltrating. It's not like a clear or harsh segregating structure, listing or categorization. So yeah, it was very important to take each object or being and think how it was uprooted from its life. It was rather an emotional process, this process in particular, because it was trying to imagine life through these beings and tools. And here's another view from the balcony. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, ways of seeing and how you see and the perspective is very important in how it determined how the form and how the space was built and made, and how the objects were placed on the display. And I think I will stop here, and maybe we can discuss more and elaborate on any desired topic. Thank you.